we go. I finally got it working. Right, there you go. There's my welcome. So we're now fully into the light lunch session. So we're looking at Matthew 20. I think when Anne, who sends out the reminders, I think I may have said that we'll go right to the end of the chapter. But in actual fact, we're just going to go up to verse 28 today. That may or may not work. It's just I figured as I was doing it, there's quite a lot that we can potentially say. And seeing as I regularly spend longer doing these than I intend to, I've cut it back down to verses 17 to 28. So I called it position, privilege, and passion because we've got a reference to the crucifixion, so passion. We've got the closeness of relationships, the privilege, and then does that give position to some of the disciples? So just kind of joining the words together and feeding my enthusiasm for 3-point sermons with alliterations and things like that. We've got 3 P's in there. So we've already gone through. I think it was in the beginning of chapter 19 in Matthew, where it's kind of stated that he's relocated down to the region areas around Jerusalem. And now we get this little phrase, as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. So that the focus now is shifting and we're beginning to head towards the climax of Jesus' ministry and life, which means we've had a single chapter that kind of has covered the southern period of Jesus' ministry. We know, though, by following the Gospel of John, that Jesus has gone down at around the turn of the new year and then into the Feast of Tabernacles. So he's been in the southern region of Judea and its outlying areas. So from about September, October, of course, running through now, this is in the right into the run up as we come into April. So we're going to head towards Passover and so on. So how many months is that? So 3. So about 6 months worth of. There's about 6 months worth of material. We don't get a huge amount in the Synoptic Gospels filling in the detail. So, but we're going to see some little kind of some layers in there where we can slot some things in kind of fitting in the story. So as we start this, Jesus is on his way towards Jerusalem. And as he does, he says he draws the 12 disciples aside privately on the road. And so he said to them, look, we're going up to Jerusalem. So we're on our way to Passover. So remember, as we're talking about Passover coming and Jesus is now beginning to turn his face towards Jerusalem, start heading there. Actually, there are going to be increasing numbers of pilgrims on the road, people who are coming up for the feasts. So as they're walking, Jesus kind of draws in his intimate 12 disciples. There will be a wider group of disciples. He's just sent out 72, as we get that from Luke's Gospel as we fill in these sections. So there's a wider kind of community of people who are probably following with Jesus at this point. But within that kind of context and all of those crowds, he draws the 12 to him. Look, we're going up. The Son of Man is going to be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. So Jesus' kind of prophetic instinct for what's about to happen to him is becoming more focused. As we're going to see, in fact, here it is right on this next verse, but they will hand him over to the Gentiles to mock, scourge, and crucify, and on the third day he'll be raised up. So what Jesus is drawing them in and kind of in intimacy confiding with them is quite a close match. Well, I say quite a close match. It is a close match, but it's also got a lot of detail in it. And it's a kind of an easy kind of thing to lean on, where we just think, well, Jesus knows everything all of the time, but that isn't the testimony. Of course, he talks about only the Father knows this. There's restrictions on Jesus' knowledge because of his humanity, and so he's discerning things in a very similar way to which we try and follow the Holy Spirit ourselves. We try and get that sense of what he's speaking to us about, what he's revealing to us. And we're kind of now moving into a phase where the pieces are getting a little bit more precise. So Jesus is aware they're going up. This is going to be his final Passover. He's more explicit about what's going to happen. He's already talked in the previous months about the cross and about his crucifixion. And he's talked about taking up your cross to follow me. That was a new layer of revelation. Prior to that, go back a little bit further, and Jesus has talked about he'd be like the sign of Jonah. As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, and there's a little bit of contradiction, you see, and this is why I wanted to draw it out, because it does bother people. So I'm not going to ignore it. That if you go back to that earlier discussion, and one of the first revelations or the first references that Jesus makes to his death and resurrection, which is related to the sign of Jonah, there he talks about 3 days and 3 nights, whereas here he talks about being raised on the 3rd day, which kind of it implies in some sort of a way, there's a missing evening. So 2 evenings and 3 days. It's one of those interesting things, because it's never particularly worried me or bothered me, but I'm just going to kind of refer into it, because it seems very obvious that as you look at it to me, that that one of the two has to be kind of a sort of a turn of speech, a way of talking. Because obviously or you kind of go through convoluted ways where we try and say, well, were there 3 nights really when it goes dark it goes dark at midday and until the 9th hour? Was that a night, etc., etc. My suspicion is it's about that actually the first phrase is a more general statement and isn't supposed to be taken quite so literally. And it's not supposed to be taken so literally, because equally it's at the point where Jesus' knowledge of exactly what's going to happen to him is still in the shaping. And so there's part of his own conversation with the Holy Spirit, with the Lord through the Father, his relationship with the Father through the Holy Spirit. He knows and he's taken on board that he is going to become a suffering Messiah. He's seen it and read it in the scriptures. He's taken those on board. He's seen something in the sign of Jonah, and that's the focus of what he says when he says 3 days and 3 nights in the like the sign of Jonah. Is he's kind of he's communicating in kind of that pictorial language something of the meaning of what he does. But at this phase, the language is more symbolic and in that kind of a phrase. It's one of those things. Occasionally, I've had, you'll meet someone. I say you'll meet someone. You might meet, say, for instance, a Muslim who make a big issue of this and say Jesus didn't know because he wasn't 3 days, and he said it would be 3 days and 3 nights. And as I say, it's never felt like that's that strong in it, that difficult an issue. Partly, it's the issue we have in that if you almost look at the Bible itself as being authored word for word by the Lord, rather than seeing it being an accurate and inspired record of the conversations and discussions, and Jesus is expressing something at that time, which within the context of what he's expressing is true, and now as it comes with greater clarity, he talks about on the 3rd day, I will be raised up, and he does seem to be very precise at this stage. So anyway, it's one of those areas. It's kind of you don't want to ignore those things, and people have come up with very kind of creative ways of trying to address the two and make them fit together precisely and accurately. And those might be the case. I'm not anti them. I just try and explaining my own kind of approach to resolving those things. But then he goes on, it says, and then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him with her sons, kneeling and asking something from him. And so one of the things that I thought, well, this is a good place to introduce. I remember reading some years back a little book, I think it's by Joachim Jeremiah, who's a Bible scholar, a little book on what he called the unwritten sayings of Jesus. That was it, or the epigrapha. The things that aren't written down in the Bible that have come to us, because there's a little bit of knowledge around this conversation, you see, that's come to us, but isn't specifically recorded in the Bible. So I'm just kind of I'm giving it to you more for information, because the discussion these things sometimes prompt is more interesting than kind of, do I actually 100% believe this was the case or that was the case. So the little image I put is something called the Marsaba letter, which is purportedly written by a guy called Clement of Alexandria, who was a Christian apologist. He was a pagan convert. He was quite scholarly. He wrote against the influences of the Gnostics and so on. So he had an important role. Some people consider him to be one of the early church fathers, others don't. It's just one of those situations. And this little document was found, I think it was in about the 50s or maybe 60s. It was found in a Coptic monastery, Marsaba, and it was photographed and reproduced and studied. But then when people went back to try and find it, they couldn't find it. Now that's that then means that the letter is kind of controversial. So, but what's kind of interesting is that some of the things that are said there are not that unsupported from other sources. So the context of the letter seems to be the way that it's spelt out, that Clement is responding to someone who's raised some issues to do with a gospel that's become known as the secret gospel of Mark. And so the kind of legend goes that as Mark has got to Alexandria, he's kind of added some stuff that weren't Peter's words into his gospel, you see. And that some who are kind of slightly more in the sort of secret inner circles and so it starts to blend into a touch of the sort of the Gnostic approach, and some of these people have got this gospel and they're using that, and so Clement is kind of trying to respond to things. Now the problem is the phrase "the secret gospel of Matthew" is very attractive, not the Matthew of Mark, but we're going to see it covers the same material as we're looking at Matthew. The secret gospel of Mark is it makes it all seem very kind of exciting, so people like that, and that one stuck. But we mainly know about it through references like this. I just try to think if there are any other references that refer to it. And he has but within the flow of the text, he makes some references to things that are in it and things that aren't. And the things that we are aware of that are in it are things that aren't really controversial. He actually says they're sort of in line with the gospel, and then he says other bits aren't in line. So when we look at the letter, we have something that does feel, in terms of its themes and some of the people that we know, it's a very real kind of context. But because we don't now have the physical piece of paper that was left behind at the monastery, it is a fact that lots of Eastern Orthodox churches, they maintained all their records locally. So archaeologically, we're regularly uncovering things buried away in various monasteries. So that story is not unreasonable. And that it was expected to be there wouldn't be unreasonable. But the trouble is, now that you can't find it again, you can't test the paper with carbon dating and things like that to see whether it was genuine or whether it had been forged later. So there are three schools of thought. There are scholars who treat it as serious historical information. There are others who treat it as a forgery of Clement a little bit later, but still quite old. And then there are others who see it as a total modern forgery that someone was going to try and sell on the black market because ancient documents have a lot of value. The problem with that theory is nobody was trying to sell it. Part of the reason why it's supposedly lost is because it got left behind at the monastery. So anyway, I'll show you the stuff, and it kind of prompts some kind of conversation around some of the characters as we go. So in the letter we got early on, I've just pulled out some little bits. I won't try and do the whole thing. Here's Clement speaking. I shan't hesitate to answer the questions you've asked, refuting the falsifications by every word of the gospel. So what he's saying is the person who's written to him has sent him some stuff or raised some questions that's coming out of this document, the kind of the Gospel of Mark with his own additions to it. And so he says, so after, for example, after, and they were on the road going to Jerusalem, you see, and what follows, until after 3 days he shall rise, the secret gospel brings the following material, word for word. So what he's saying is, in Mark's gospel, we've got this process where they're setting off for Jerusalem until after 3 days he shall arise. Well, this therefore is now covering exactly the period we just looked at. So if I quickly go back, here it is. So Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. He drew the 12 disciples aside privately. At the end, they'll crucify him. On the third day, he'll be raised up. So this is the context that he's about to discuss, and the information that's in there. So the Marsaba letter is giving us information on Mark 10, which is 32 to 45, which is covering the same verses as we're looking at Matthew. So I don't normally add kind of comments and notes, but I threw it in there while I was doing it today. Starting with an account of the raising of Lazarus. You see, that's interesting, because obviously the raising of Lazarus we only know from John's Gospel, not from the 3 synoptics. And it doesn't happen right now, but actually if you look at the way he raises it, you'll see it's kind of a reference back. So it's happening before the events that he's just about to cover. But he talks about as Jesus is going up to Jerusalem, and then it makes reference to the events, as we can see, which looks like the raising of Lazarus. I suspect that in the mind of the writer, the Jesus has been heading up towards Jerusalem ever since he left Galilee in around September to October time. So since the point he's kind of made his way down secretly for the Feast of Tabernacles, there is a kind of a sense in which he's on his way towards Jerusalem. But if we, from John's Gospel, we get the sense of the raising of Lazarus being a few months before Jesus arrives for Passover. But here he puts it in this flow. He's heading up towards Jerusalem, and he tells a story which isn't the main focus. There's more information here, but this isn't the main bit I was wanting to get, because this is outside of Matthew's Gospel, and we're looking at Matthew's Gospel. But I thought while I was doing it, sometimes it's interesting just to see, because there are those who like to say, "Oh, we don't have any other, we don't really have any other evidence other than written by Christians." Well, I suppose even this is supposedly written by Christians, but what they mean by is evidence for the Gospels outside the Gospel. Well, we do have things like this, even though its provenance is a little bit shady, but it's not a total write-off. Is what I was driving at before. You can take it seriously. Some choose, and I think the idea of it as a modern forgery doesn't quite make sense to me, because no one's ever tried to sell it, you see. And it doesn't actually say very much. It's very controversial. So, normally those are the reasons why people do modern forgeries. It might be by Clement, maybe it was an ancient forgery rather than it being from him, but why is the question. Again, it doesn't say anything particularly controversial. It's actually claiming to say some of the bits that are claimed to be in this secret text aren't so good. But the things he does tell us are all things that make reasonable sense. So I take it kind of semi-seriously. Is that the right phrase? Is that the right word? It's not something you'd want to kind of put your whole kind of academic career on. But I can't see huge numbers of reasons not to take it reasonably sensibly. So the secret gospel brings the following material. So this is him talking about this book that's supposedly there, which is Mark's gospel with some of Mark's extra information in it that he didn't hear directly from Peter. So he says, and they came to Bethany. So this is, as I say, it's a little bit of a throwback. And a certain woman whose brother had died was there. See, so we similar to Matthew and Mark's gospels, there's anonymity for a lot of characters. We now know them as Mary and Martha, the sisters, and there's two of them rather than one. She prostrated herself before Jesus, saying, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And the disciples rebuked her. Well, that's in the flow of things, as we're going to see. The disciples have been very honest in this phrases in the last few chapters we've been working through. We've regularly seen Jesus having to rebuke in small ways or challenge the attitudes, and that's again the theme today. It's understanding the status of those who are close to Jesus, and Jesus kind of emphasizing to them that actually what they're going to see in the crucifixion is the Son of God, who they've come to know him as the Son of God, is going to allow himself to be identified with the slave's death. Crucifixion, as we've got more specific here, to crucify him, is particularly reserved for people who've rebelled against the Roman state and for slaves. It's kind of a way of saying you are someone with no status at all. So there's something about the status that is being challenged, and it needs to be challenged multiple times as we go through. It becomes a theme that's regularly there in the Synoptic Gospels. So the disciples who recorded the Synoptic Gospels for us, or gave birth to them at least, because they were, I believe, behind Matthew's Gospel, putting those things together. They've been very honest about their failings in understanding this radical turnaround. So it's not out of keeping to have them here kind of rebuking Mary for kind of clamouring at Jesus. Although from John's Gospel we get the kind of the story about the news coming to him and so on. So slightly different, but in line. And Jesus being angered is different again. He went into the garden where the tomb was, and straight away a great cry was heard from the tomb. So the way we're hearing the story is slightly different. Jesus rolled away the stone from the door of the tomb, going in where the youth was. He stretched forth his hand and raised him. But presumably the guy's already alive at this stage in the way this story is being told, because he's already cried out. And going out of their tomb, they came into the house, for he was rich. Well, that you see, although this letter was only found in the last century, there's been a long Christian tradition that Lazarus is rich. So this looks like Lazarus, and he does seem to have, his sisters seem to be older than he is. He seems to almost have been, which is it seems that they have kind of looked after him as he's coming into his maturity to take on his inheritance. So those things were things that speculated and bits of information we get elsewhere. So it's kind of in line with that. And so after 6 days, Jesus told him what to do. And in the evening before they leave, you see, the youth comes in, and apparently he's wearing a linen cloth over his naked body. Now, why does Clement address this? Well, we'll see in a minute. It's because he's going to refute some things to do with Gnosticism. So he's just telling the story. The guy comes in the evening. He's just wrapped in a piece of linen cloth, but he sits there all night with Jesus, and Jesus teaches him the mystery of the kingdom. Then he returned to the other side of the Jordan, and part of the reason Clement kind of addresses it is because there was a kind of in various Gnostic kind of ideas, there you often find the issues of nudity and male nudity and homosexuality all kind of getting blended into the mix. And so he tells this story, although it's kind of after the passage we're looking at. And then he goes on and says, and after these words follows the text, James and John came to him, and all that section. But the naked man with naked man, quotes, and other things about which you wrote, they are not found. So what Clement is saying is, there was this event that happened in the kind of general flow of stuff, and there was a young guy who's wrapped himself in a linen thing that Jesus has been teaching, who he's the young man that he raised from the dead, but that's about it. That's the only thing where nakedness has come into it. So it's nothing is found. So that's that event, nothing to do with Matthew's Gospel and what we're looking at today. But after these words, he comes into Jericho, and the secret gospel adds, I've given the ... So he's going to add some information to what we know about Jesus in Jericho and the events with Jesus and his disciples and their mother. So we come back to Matthew's account. So I've kind of laid a little bit of a foundation, and as I say, it's a bit off-piste. But I've never actually, the first time I've never actually tried to pull in any of the text from this letter before. So this is the first time I put them onto a PowerPoint. So it was useful for me to kind of pull those things in for other teaching things. So the mother of James and John comes, and she says, "What do you want?" In Mark's Gospel, it just says James and John are there, and they're asking. And she answered and said, "Say that these two sons of mine might sit, one on your right hand and one on your left, in your kingdom." But Jesus answered, saying, you don't know what you ask for. Are you able to drink the cup from which I'm about to drink? And you notice I put in little triangular brackets, and be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with. That's because not all ancient manuscripts have that extra little phrase. So some do, some don't, that kind of follow on. And they said to him, we are able. There's no problem with that. If Jesus said the whole phrase, and some Gospels don't record the whole phrase, there were lots of things that he would have said that he doesn't say, so it's just there. But he pushes it back to them. Are you able to drink the cup which I'm about to drink? Now, to kind of just try and work out what's the best way to kind of lay these things out. So anyway, okay, let's go through the text first, and then I'll refer back. So they said, yes, we are able. And so Jesus says to them, indeed, you will drink my cup and will be baptized with the baptism I'm to be baptized with. But to sit at my right and left sides, this is not mine to give. For whom it has been prepared, but for whom it has been prepared by my Father. When the 10 heard, they were indignant with the two brothers. So you're seeing that here's a passage where status. Jesus is going to address it again when it comes to the Last Supper, which is not far away now. The issue of status and their closeness to him and the position that gives them is being discussed, and even within that, who the hierarchies within the community of the 12 itself. If we take in Luke's account, we now know that hierarchy extends to more people, because now there are 72 people to others officially adopted into the structure, along with the even wider crowd of disciples. So as things are getting bigger and status is becoming more of an issue, we find it being addressed time and time again. But Jesus summoned them and said, you know that the rulers of the nations lord it over them, and the high-ranking exercise authority over them. It will not be like that with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And I'm just looking, do you know what? I've set up, sorry, I've set up and I've not actually included, I actually think I accidentally deleted it. So I'm going to have to do this from memory. The bits from the Marsaba letters that actually directly relate to this passage. So I've really messed that one up there. If you give me a second, I think I can recover them. So let me just quickly. I'm going to quickly go and. So I will come down here. No, okay, don't think I'll be able to recover it. So let me quickly go back to where we were. What an idiot I am. Sorry. I've given you all that introduction. And the reason I wanted to include the reference to that letter was because there's an interesting little thing, and I was going to show you by showing the actual text to see exactly how it fits. But for some strange reason, I think I even prepared it, and I think I've accidentally deleted the slide I put it on. So let's come back to here. And I'll have to do it from memory. So it talks about how after James and John have been, he said all of that. Then he says, and beyond that, he said everything else. So the things I've just described, the things about Lazarus, those are okay. And the fact that he was naked, well, that maybe stands behind why you're asking this question about nudity, but that's all it was. And now, but after the things with James and John, there's an extra little bit. And there it talks about the disciple that was loved by Jesus, which often people look at and you read that and we think of the author of John's Gospel. And on that, and at this point, it talks about him coming with his mother coming to Jesus with his mother and Salome. Now, Salome seems to be the mother of from the Gospels, the name of the mother of James and John. You see, and although it talks about his mother, his mother in the Marsaba letter could be Jesus, his mother, or it could be the disciple's mother. Now, if the disciple is John, you see, and that probably means then that the reference to his mother is Jesus' mother, because Jesus is in there in the sentence as well, in which case Salome makes a good fit for being the mother of the beloved disciple, you see. And so the thing that I look at, and I think what's kind of interesting here, is that there are various theories as to how you fit the family of Jesus together. And if you very often when you're doing when I'm doing a walkthrough of the last week, I kind of work on the assumption that James and John's mother is Salome. She is therefore Mary's sister, and that makes it nice and easy. There are other theories where Salome is an independent character, as one of the women from Galilee, but is a friend of Jesus's mother. But the nice thing is, or the interesting thing is, this little text raises all of these characters, but they are all positionally in the kinds of places that make sense for them. So the incident that's then being described is after the mother of James and John coming and asking for them to sit on the left and on the right. But now there's also Jesus' mother there. But remember, positionally, we're now in the flow towards Jerusalem that is beginning to happen for the Passover feast in preparation. The very next thing we're going to be moving on to is Jesus is heading into Jerusalem for the Passover and gets to Bethany, you see. That's going to be chapter 21 of Matthew. So we're very close to that. And in this context, we've had a little thing where an appeal has been made by a woman that could be Jesus' aunt. Because it would then seem that, and there's a long standing tradition in the church that James and John therefore are cousins of Jesus. And here we have now, in addition to, they've already done it once, it talks about them coming again, but this time his mother is there. Looks like Jesus' mother is there. And Jesus refuses to talk to them, you see. but that actually kind of fits the flow. There's an appeal being made, and then it's kind of like there's extra pressure going on from within the family. If Jesus' aunt Salome has now met up with Jesus' mother, and remember we meet Salome and Mary in the same context. They seem to be crossing over when we get to the Passover narratives and Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, and at the very end, Jesus says to the beloved disciple, if he's John. Take your mother, take your mother and leave the cross. And when he goes, Salome disappears from the cross as well, you see. So some of you who've gone through that will know with greater clarity what I'm talking about. But I just thought it's a nice little, I always find it an interesting touch, because some of those kind of interplay of people have been worked out very separate from knowing this bit of information, but that there is this little piece of information as an ancient document that seems to be kind of giving us a kind of a hint that there was almost two phases to the appeal for position within the kingdom of God. One made by his aunt on behalf of two of the disciples who were Jesus' cousins and therefore ought to have special status. And when it doesn't quite work out, how the appeal is almost, it seems like, attempted a second time as they're leaving Jericho, but when Jesus' mother is flowing through the event. And the fact that Jesus' mother appears in the crucifixion narratives alongside Salome does kind of fit with the idea of the fact that perhaps there's a kind of a family connection that's kind of come down the traditional pilgrim route towards Jerusalem, and at some point they have crossed over with the discipleship group that they're heading down, and there's this little dialogue going on between the two. So that was my wonderful point to try and draw out and just kind of highlight to folks. And I totally messed it up by deleting the two slides I had that actually showed the text side by side. So you'll have to take my word for it. Let's come back. because actually we know that Jesus rejects it. And what I wanted to get across was the familial connections that seem to be in play. So it's not just that these are two disciples that have been with Jesus right from the beginning, James and John. We know from the Gospel of John that they've been around since the days when Jesus with John the Baptist, and it's that little family connection is probably why Jesus relocates to Capernaum, because they've got their fishing work is going on around there. You see, it's why their father Zechariah is often given special status, although he doesn't seem to do anything. Is probably because he's the uncle, you see. So it's all of those kinds of things. So they've got all those connections, they've done all of those things, and yet Jesus kind of highlights to them, none of this is what's going to give you status. None of this is what's going to give you status. And it's the challenge to that idea, because and it's not unreal. It's not an unreal temptation. Because the gospel, as it's gone out around the world, the Church of Jesus Christ is enormous. There is no bigger religious organisation, and some churches can get very big, and the Lord does amazing things, and people are thrilled by those things, and because of their humanity, they will want to honour those who are seeing the miracles happen around them. There's a huge temptation to want to understand spiritual authority like earthly authority. And so I think that's part of the reason why time and time again we get these references that are trying to turn the thing upside down. It's not finished yet. We're going to have more. Well, we're not in Matthew's Gospel, not so explicitly in this in the Last Supper. But if you blend them all together, you see again at the Last Supper there's a very clear turning over. The washing of feet, which, as I say, is not in Matthew's Gospel, but is there. Jesus is constantly trying to get his disciples to understand, because Jesus would know that they will always have the possibility and the temptation to see the success and the affirmation of their benefit and value from those that they will be helping. As the gospel explodes and the success of what's going on, they will always have that temptation to see it and to take hold of it in a way that isn't the kingdom way, to really then undermine the very, very kind of subversive and radical message that is embedded within Scripture and in the gospel. So Jesus' response, whoever wants to be first among you must be a bond servant. So he's kind of unpacking what we've just had a week or so ago, as we've talked about it, but maybe only days before with the disciples, that the first will be last. So what does that mean? The first being last isn't just a kind of soundbite. It actually means something. You've got to be, actually I have to go back. First must be, instead, whoever wants to become great must become like a servant. And you'll notice there's a difference in servant and bond servant. They are different words in the Greek. The servant is the kind of person who waits on you. They've got a slightly more genteel thing. So it's where we start in our service. Try and serve gently. Where I can help, I do help. So you've got to start like that. If you want to become great among you, you must be the grace. If you want to become great among you, then you first got to be a servant. And if you want to be first, you must become like a bond servant. So i.e. a slave. It literally is a slave, but I'm just kind of emphasising it's a step. It's in one sense they're both of the same type, but one is a deeper level. Just as the Son of Man just as the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And so the issue that's been raised with them in intimacy and privacy as the pilgrims are moving down towards Jerusalem, and the explicit spelling out of the crucifixion and the cross being a real thing, which means that Jesus is going to willingly, freely choose to identify with the punishment and condition of those who are considered the worst and the lowest of the low. And in that context, where they're still then talking about and trying to vie for what their position is in the kingdom, and everything is being put into play that can be. It's not just that James and John have been there for lots and lots of important miracles. They've often been close to Jesus when he's gone in to do things. You were there for the raising of Jairus' daughter and so on, isn't it? So often you hear about Peter, James and John going in close together. They've had those levels of intimacy. Well, that hasn't brought them status. The fact that their mother is either immediate related or there does seem to be some sort of connection familiarly, and we know about her, and we know that actually there was a whole section of the church that identified with Salome. We find references to her in ancient church literature. So she's a significant character in that sort of sense. But in all of those things, none of that really matters. What really matters is you understand Jesus' identification with the lowest servants, the lowest slaves, and punishment that is unjust for them, and just receiving it like slaves have to receive in those ways. You've got to become like that. And it can start, if you just want any kind of status in the kingdom at all, it starts in your service. You're a servant, you're a kind of a waiter, you're a kind of a manservant, you're a kind of genteel servant. And if you want to be first, then you become like the bondservant. There's real greatness in great servitude. And that radical message has infected the Western world. Not that the church has only infected the Western world, but when we see the West kind of in many ways losing the benefits of its Christian foundation, we start to realise how unique it was that the weak are often looked after, and those kind of there are sort of there are priorities that people who don't own the name of Jesus have absorbed from a culture that has become insaturated with this concept that there is an equality and a familyhood of all of creation under God that turns our perspective around and means we need to look at it very differently. And so although we can see all sorts of problems and things that being lost, the truth of the matter is that all of the best bits of the Western world, and just as they are in other cultures, normally root themselves back into something of the gospel message, and that identification that Jesus is willing to take on with the greatest glory that God is giving him is identified with the cross, which is a slave's punishment. And he doesn't mind to be identified with that because it represents something of truth, and it's a truth that he wants his church to take on board. So that is